Hello there. In this video we are going to take all that we've learned about CSS and apply it to a web page. I created some starter files, so hopefully you downloaded those and loaded them up into Sublime Text. So the folder that I gave you was CSS Layout Activity, and it's got a few different files in it. We're going to be updating the index.html file, and that's the code that you're seeing right here. Now if you look here on lines 6 and 7, we are linking to two style sheets. So one of these is what we call a reset style sheet, and we're not going to mess around with that one. And the other one we will be playing with, that's the main style sheet. Those are both inside of this folder, the style sheets folder. And the reset one, just to give you a little more information, that's one that I just got off the internet, and what that does is it kind of evens out the differences between the way the browsers display CSS. So that's a nice little thing because it applies all these CSS rules that kind of make everything look the same regardless of whether you're looking at your page in Chrome or IE or Safari or whatever. So we won't touch the reset one, but we will be working in the main style sheet in just a little bit here. Now I want to point out that I did put some JavaScript in here, and I know that we haven't gotten a JavaScript in the course yet, but so we're going to kind of just ignore this too, but I'll show you how we're going to make use of it at the end of the video here. So before we dive in and start updating all the CSS code in our main CSS file, let's just go ahead and take a look at what we have for HTML. So I'm going to go to the index page here and just going to kind of quickly run down the page here. So here on lines 5 and 6, as I mentioned, we have the links to the style sheets. On line 7, we're linking to a JavaScript file. You can ignore this for now because we haven't talked about JavaScript, but I want you to notice how the page is set up as far as its layout. We've got a header element, and inside of that is an H1, so that's going to be our banner. Like usually you see like the company name across the banner on a web page. And then we have a nav element, and that's going to contain the nav bar. Underneath the nav bar we have a div called content. Now that's really going to be containing two items of content. First of all, it's going to be containing the main element, so that's going to be the main content of the page, but we're also going to have a sidebar here too, so we have an aside element inside that div as well. So we've got the content div, and inside of that we have a main element, and then we have an aside element, and those two are, the main and the aside, are siblings. And then at the bottom of the page we have a footer element. So this is kind of following a standard layout for web pages. Now there is this div here at the very bottom of the body underneath the footer, and I'll explain what this is later. This is going to come into play when people view our web page on a small screen like a cell phone. So there is an extra div here that we'll address later. Let's see what this page looks like in the browser. So here it is, nothing much to look at. There is not much CSS applied to it, so it looks really plain. So throughout this video we're going to add CSS rule sets to spice up this page and make it look nice, or at least nicer than it does now. Okay, let's go back and look in the main style sheet here. So I'm in main.css. Now I've already added some code here, some CSS code. I've got a few rule sets that are targeting elements in the page. So we're just setting the default font size for the entire body element to 14 pixels, setting some font settings for H1 elements and H3 elements, and then also setting some settings for paragraphs. So that's what I've got started. Now I do also have a rule set here that's targeting that mobile nav button div that's at the bottom of the page, and I'm just going to ignore this for now, but we'll come back to this later. So we're going to start right under that rule set. So you can put your cursor on line 23 and we will get started here. So go ahead and type in this rule set. So we're using a tag selector. We're targeting the header element, setting its height to 80 pixels and its background color to red. So go ahead and add that rule set to your style sheet, and then save your changes. So I'm doing Control S here to save my changes, and then we'll switch back over to the browser and go back over to the browser here and refresh the page, and now you can see that the banner has the red background and it's 80 pixels tall. Alright, let's move on here. So we've styled the header a little bit, and here is the next rule set that we're going to add. Alright, so here's what I've added. Now this selector is targeting H1 elements that are nested somewhere within the header element and just making the font color to white. So if you go ahead and save your changes there, and after you type in the rule set, and then check it out in the browser. So I'll do that now. Just going to scroll up a little bit here. Save your changes. Alt tab back to the browser, and now you can see that the text is white. Now we might want to, give some padding or margin around here to make this look better, but that's not really the point of this video. We're more interested in the layout of the page, so I'm not going to address some of the fine details. We're just focused on the layout of the page for this activity. Okay, go back to the style sheet, and then let's add this rule set here. So here we are using an ID selector. It's got the pound sign before it, so we're targeting an element by its ID, setting the height to 30 pixels and the background color to orange. Now I'm going to go ahead and save my changes here, and let's see what we're targeting in the HTML file. So if I scroll on up to here, here's exactly what we're targeting. It's the nav element because it has an ID of main nav. So we'll go back to the CSS. Actually, we'll go back to the browser and see what it looks like when we refresh here. So there you go. So now you can see there's some overflow here. The links are spilling over. We set the height to 30 pixels here and the background color to orange. Well, that's not big enough to accommodate all these links. It's kind of hard to see there, but they're spilling over that orange boundary. But we'll add another rule set that'll take care of that, because we're going to have the links go across like this instead of stacking vertically. So we'll add some CSS code in a minute to take care of that. So the next rule set that I want you to add is going to be this one. Put it right underneath the last one there, and now what we're doing is targeting UL elements that are inside the main nav, and just setting the margin and padding to 0. And before we actually check it in the browser, let's add another rule set here. So we'll go ahead and have you add this one as well. So here we are targeting LI elements that are nested within UL elements that are nested within the main nav element. So we're setting the height to 100%, the list style to none. We don't want to see the bullets. That's why we're getting rid of the list style. That'll get rid of those bullets that show up next to list items inside of unordered lists. And then we're going to set the display to inline block. And what that's going to do is that's going to make these LI elements go across the page instead of stacking vertically. So the default setting for the display property of an LI element is to be block. And you know that block level elements stack vertically. Well, what we want to do is we want this to act like an inline element, so that we want the links to go across the page instead of stacking vertically. And what we also want to do is we want to be able to set the height and width of these LI elements too, which is why I chose the inline block property here. So it's kind of a hybrid between an inline element and a block level element. So let's go ahead and see what these two rule sets look like now that we've added them in the browser here. So I'll save my changes, switch back over to the browser and hit refresh, and now you can see that they're going across the page like that. Okay, go back to the code here, and let's go ahead and add another rule set. We'll add it right here. Now we're targeting the anchor tags, the A elements that are inside those LI items that are inside the UL that's inside the nav bar here. So now anchor elements, A elements are inline by default, but I'm going to turn them into block level elements just so that we can set their height and width here. Now I suppose I could have made this inline block if I wanted to, but I just chose to make them block level. And then by setting the line height the same as the height, they're both 30 pixels, the height and the line height, that makes it easy to center the text within them. You can see that we're coloring it white, and we're setting the padding to 0 pixels on the top and bottom, and then 20 pixels on the left and right. Okay, so go ahead and save that. Whoops. And then open the page up, refresh the page in the browser, and now you can see the effect that it had on the elements in the nav bar. So things are starting to shape up. Still got a long way to go though. Alright, let's go back over to the code. And let's add another rule set here. So I'm going to move down here, paste this rule set in, and so now you can see that we're targeting those same anchor elements that we were targeting in the above rule set, but now we're targeting them when they're in their hover state. So this is a pseudo selector here because we're targeting those anchor elements when they're being hovered over. So we're going to make the background color pink here. So if you go ahead and save the changes there, and then switch back over to the browser and hit refresh. Now when you hover over them, you can see that the background color turns pink. I am colorblind, by the way, if you haven't already noticed, so my color choices aren't very sound. Okay, let's go back over to the code here, and whoops, the code that is right here, and let's add our next rule set. So now we're done with the nav bar for now. We've added quite a few rule sets to style the nav bar. Now what we're going to do is we're going to target that div that has an ID of content. So here is the rule set for you to add. It's an ID selector. Now remember, inside this div, the div that has this ID of content, we have a main element and an aside element. So what we're going to eventually do is turn those into a 2-column layout with the main element on the left and the aside element on the right. Now we're going to be floating those elements, and so you can run into problems when you float elements. The collapsed div phenomena, which we talked about in a previous lesson, and to overcome that, there's a few different ways you can handle it, and I've chosen to use this one, which is to set the overflow equal to auto on the parent element of any floated elements. So we're going to float the main and the aside element later. But just to prevent that collapsed div phenomenon from happening, I'm going to set the overflow to auto on their parent here. So we won't really see any changes by adding the CSS, but it will come into play later. So let's just move on before we look at this one in the browser. All right, let's go ahead and let's add another rule set here. Now we're targeting the main element, which is a child of the content div that we just wrote a rule set for. We're floating it to the left, and we're setting its width to 70%. Now I want to be able to add some padding to it, but I don't want it to mess up my math. So what I did here is I used the box sizing property and set it to border box. So that's nice because what we saw in a previous lesson is that if you don't set this property here to the box sizing to border box, then your math can get messed up because without this property here on my line 68, then my width is actually going to be bigger than 70%. It's going to be 70% plus the 20% or the 20px here for padding. So by adding this property here, the border box, it's going to say we want the width to be 70%, and that's going to include the padding. Okay. Now we won't see much going on here until I add the next rule set. So go ahead and add this rule set here. Okay, so now we're targeting the aside element. We're floating it to the left, so the main and the aside elements are going to stack up right next to each other because of the float there. We're setting the background color to orange, and the width equal to 30%. So the main element's going to take up 70%. That column's going to be 70% wide, and the aside's going to be 30% wide. And the nice thing is by using these percents for the width, that makes our web page responsive or fluid. And I'll show you what that looks like here. So go ahead and save your changes, Control S, and then go back to the browser and hit refresh. And now you can see that the the main element is 70% and the sidebar is 30%, and if I resize the screen, they're going to adapt. So they're stretching and shrinking as the screen width changes. Now it looks kind of funny because I don't have the orange background going all the way down to the bottom here. There are ways we can fix that. So if you want to do that, I can show you a few different ways to fix that. Now notice that I don't have any padding here on the side element here, and I want to change that. So I'm going to go back to the code here. Here it is, and I actually want to go ahead and add 2 more properties to this rule set. So put your cursor right there. We're going to add 2 more properties to this rule set, and they're going to look like that. So we want to add some padding, but we also don't want it to blow up our layout, so I set the box sizing to border box 2. So that's going to make sure that the width remains 30% regardless of the padding that we add. Okay, if I go ahead and save that and reload it in the browser, I should see some padding there. So now that looks a little bit better, some breathing room. Okay, let's go back to the code here. Here we go, and now let's style the footer here. So go ahead and add this rule set for your footer. We're just gonna make it 28 pixels tall, set the background color, set the font size, and the font color. Let's go ahead and enter that code, and then save your changes, and go back over to the browser, and let's see what it looks like here now. Okay, there we go. Now, let's see here. I'm tempted to go ahead and address this issue because it looks funny to me that the background color doesn't go all the way down to the footer, but if you want, we can fix that in class if you want. Now, what we want to do here next is we want to make this page look really good on really tiny screens. So as the width gets smaller and smaller, you can see that I really don't have room for 2 columns anymore. So what we're going to do next is we'll add a media query that's going to make some changes to our CSS. We're going to do 2 things here. We're going to make the banner shorter so that it's not as tall. We want to have as much real estate for the main content as possible, so we're going to make the banner shorter. And then what we'll also do is we'll make this layout so that the sidebar moves down to underneath the main element, so that we're going to go back to a 1-column layout. And we may not have enough room for all of our links, so I'll show you what we'll do with the nav bar too. We're going to make a button that you press to display the nav link. So the first thing we're going to do is add a media query to our style sheet here. So I'm going to scroll down a bit, and then I want you to go ahead and add this code. Now I've added some comments. You could add those if you wanted to or not, either way. But what this means is that when the width of the window becomes 800 pixels or less, then the rules that are inside these curly braces here are going to apply, and if they conflict with any of the rules up above, these ones down here in the media query will override them. So that's how we can, and I'll show you what we're going to do with this here. So let's go ahead and add a rule set inside the media query here. So put your cursor in between those curly braces right there. Suppose that's good. And then go ahead and paste in or type in this code here. So we're just targeting the header, and we're setting its height to 44 pixels. So here's what I want to show you. So I'll go ahead and save my changes here once you get that typed in. And then if we go over to our browser here, I'm going to stretch it out. Here's what it's looking like. I just refreshed the page so it picks up our changes, and now you should see that when I get down to 800 pixels, see how the header dropped in size there. So I can kind of move it back and forth and show you that's where our breakpoint is kicking in here. So it shrinks down to a height of 44 pixels when the width of the screen becomes less than 800 pixels. So I'm right at about 800 right now. I'm less than 800, but if I drag the window a little bit bigger, and now you can see it snaps back to its original height that we set up above. Okay, let's add another rule set here. go ahead and type in this code. So here we're targeting the main element and the aside element, and remember up above we floated those so that they would stack horizontally, and then we set their widths to 70% and 30%. Well, what we're doing here is we're taking away the float, so this will make them stack vertically again. We want this to turn back into a one-column layout for small screen sizes, because the screens under 800 pixels don't really have enough real estate to accommodate 2 columns. So we take away the float, and that'll make them stack vertically, and then we need to adjust their width to 100%. So we're basically setting these back to the default values for block level elements, whereas up above we floated them and adjusted their width to make them fit side by side. So here we're reversing that. So let's see what this looks like now when we save this and run it in the browser. So there we go. So once I get down to less than 800 pixels, you can see that it goes to a one-column layout, and the main element is stacked underneath, I'm sorry, the aside element is stacked underneath the main element. If I stretch the browser window to beyond 800 pixels, then it goes back to our 2-column layout here. Okay, let's go ahead and add another rule set to our media query here. And it's going to look like this. So now we're targeting our nav bar, and what we're doing here is we're just repositioning it, and we're using absolute positioning to do it. And yeah, some of these rules might look a little bit strange to you. Just go ahead and type them in and we'll see how it turns out here. I'm not going to run this in the page yet. Let's keep working on the rule sets for the nav bar here. I'm going to give you a few more here. So I'm going to give them to you all at once here. So I'm going to put my cursor right underneath that last rule set. Now remember, I need to be inside the media query here, so the media query ends with this curly brace down here for me on line 117. So I want to add these. There's a few rule sets we're going to add right here. Okay, there we go. So here, this is, I think I just put this here to prevent overflow from happening here, but we're targeting LI elements in the main nav. And here we are this is going to be using some JavaScript here. So I'll explain this a little bit better in a second, but we're adding a class selector here for things that are for our main nav, and this is going to toggle its width. So I imagine this is going to be kind of strange for all of you, but this has to do with the JavaScript that we're about to add. And then we're just setting the display of the LI element and our nav bar button, and I'll show you that in just a minute. We'll display those as block. So here, let's just go ahead and type all this in. I know I didn't explain it very well, but this one is the one I want to focus on right now. So up above we had a selector that targeted this, and I kind of left you in the dark about this. I put that there in the starter files. Well, and that's related to the div that's in the bottom of the page here. So here it is. Here's that div in our HTML, and let me show you how this is going to work now. So a lot of times when the width of the screen shrinks, we don't have a whole lot of room for all of our nav links. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh this now. Did I save all my changes? No, I didn't. Let me save my changes, and then I'll refresh the screen here. Now let's watch what happens to the nav bar here when we see that. Now the nav bar went away. Notice that? But what appeared is our div right here, and that's that mobile nav div that's at the very bottom of the HTML. Now the reason why it's showing up here instead of underneath the footer where the code appears is because I used absolute positioning to put it here. So you can see that its top is set to, I think, 44 pixels or something like that, and it's set to be 0 pixels from the right. So here's, instead of showing all the nav links, what we'll do is we'll have a menu button for smaller screens, and you can see that if the width of the screen gets beyond 800 pixels, then we'll snap back to our regular navigation. Okay, now we do need a little bit of JavaScript code to finish this off, and I know you haven't we haven't covered JavaScript yet, so I actually gave you the JavaScript code. It's in the file, and let's see, it's in this file over here. Don't worry about this, we can talk about this later, but hopefully it's all ready to go here. Let's see what happens now. There you go. So there's JavaScript right there making that our nav show up as a little flyout menu here. So I'll show you again. Looks like I got a little scrolling issue here, but we can try and figure that out later. But this is JavaScript. When you press this button, our nav bar slides out from the side, and all those rule sets that we added at the very end of our media query are altering the nav bar so that it looks like this instead of stacking across. So there you have it, a little JavaScript magic. So here's what our page looks like on a small screen, like maybe a cell phone, and here's what it should look like on a larger screen like that. That'll do it.